You can go ahead and open your Bibles to Genesis 41. And have you ever taken a stress test? Not a cardiac stress test, but a stress test in the business environment? Have you ever taken one of those? What they do is they evaluate, they give you all these hypothetical questions, and then they evaluate your answers to them. They give you these situations. It may be, you might, am I okay? You might not, in the military, in civil service, more people had heart attacks doing the job I used to do than any other career field in the military, selling groceries, if you can believe that. High pressure job, working directly for the base commander and of course his wife, and a lot of personnel issues, a lot of financial issues because they wanted you to run stores with no losses, and but you didn't sell anything for profit. You weren't allowed to. There was no markup on your groceries. When the military sells groceries, there's no markup. That's why it's such a big benefit to the military. So once a year, we used to have these worldwide conferences where they would send us to different places, and they would have all these classes. And one of them, they always had these classes that you had to go to in regards to stress. So they give you these tests, and you'd rate yourself in all these areas, and then they would grade them, and they would tell you, you're stressed. And you'd say, that's all right, I'm going to the bar as soon as I get done here, so it'll be all right. And that's really was the most common way of stress coping, not only for people in the commissaries, but for the military in general. But I want you to consider just for a few minutes the stress of Joseph, okay? Joseph now, at this point in our study, Joseph has been in Egypt for 13 years, okay? And what has he been doing? What was the first thing he did? He was a slave. What was the second thing he did? He was thrown into prison, okay? And now after 13 years, he's put into a new job. He's got a new home, a wife, a family, and he is, in essence, attempting to help a country survive a famine. And not only that country, but all the countries around them will be dependent upon them during this famine. So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge, and Joseph knows he's been living it, but now he must really know that he needs God's help. And he has an enormous undertaking in front of him. And, you know, there has to be a lot of barriers involved here. Can you imagine the general population thinking, they're probably thinking Pharaoh has flipped because he's put an ex-slave, ex-convict, foreigner in charge of the government, okay? So I want us to look at these verses, and then we'll answer these questions as we go along. Genesis 41, 33 through 36, and you can, and if you would just then, somebody read that for us, and somebody else read 46 through 49, somebody else 53 through 57, and somebody else then in chapter 47, 13 through 26. If you would read those things for us.
Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine.
46 to 49.
And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh the king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout the land of Egypt. And in the 720th years the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which
53 through 57.
The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world.
In the last section, 47:13 through 26.
Meanwhile, the famine became worse and worse, and the crops continued to fail throughout Egypt and Canaan. Joseph collected all the money in Egypt and Canaan in exchange for grain, and he brought the money to Pharaoh's treasure house. When the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, they came to Joseph crying again for food. "Our money is gone," they said, "but give us bread. Why should we die?" "Well, then," Joseph replied, "since your money is gone, give me your livestock. I'll give you food in exchange." So they gave their livestock to Joseph in exchange for food. Soon all the horses, flocks, herds, and donkeys of Egypt were in Pharaoh's possession, but at least they were able to purchase food for that year. The next year they came again and said, "Our money is gone and our livestock are yours. We have nothing left for our bodies and land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we will then become servants to Pharaoh. Just give us grain so that our lives may be safe, so that the land will not become empty and desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold them their fields because the famine was so severe, and their land then belonged to Pharaoh. Thus all the people of Egypt became servants to Pharaoh. The only land he didn't buy was that belonging to the priests, for they were assigned food from Pharaoh and didn't need to sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "See, I brought you and your land to Pharaoh, and I'll provide you the seeds you can plant your fields. And then when you harvest it, a fifth of your crop will belong to Pharaoh. Keep 4 fifths for yourself and use it to plant the next year's crop and to feed yourself and your household and your little ones." "You have saved our lives," they exclaimed. "May it please you, sir, to let us be Pharaoh's servants." Joseph then made a law throughout the land of Egypt, and it is still the law, that Pharaoh should receive 1/5 of all crops grown on his land. And since Pharaoh had not taken over the priest's land, they were exempt from this payment.
Okay, thank you, Gordy. So what were Joseph's initial responsibilities?
Inspect the land.
Okay. Pharaoh appointed Joseph to oversee the land. Joseph actually picked selected officers to function under him, to manage the land. And what percentage of the grain did they store? 1/5. And how old was Joseph? And how far did he travel to fulfill his duties? Look in 46. He went out from the president and went throughout the land, okay? Throughout the land. And he probably traveled by boat because the Egyptians had a rather remarkable irrigation system at that time, and they would travel pretty far distances in these small boats that they had adapted for that kind of travel. How did the people pay for their grain initially? With money, and then after the money was gone, they used livestock, and then after the livestock, they sold their land. And that really, and then themselves, they sold themselves into slavery. But really, were they worried about being slaves? No. What were they worried about? Yeah, they were worried about eating. I don't think, now it doesn't say here, but I don't think Pharaoh was giving them any cell phones. I didn't read that part. Did you read that part? Oh, you didn't read that part? I don't think they were getting any, they were getting some grain, but they were only getting grain because they were joined into a system. Who benefited from the system? Pharaoh did. So Pharaoh was pretty happy about the guy he selected, wasn't he? He had to think he was pretty good. And what was the people's attitude towards Joseph? They were grateful, yeah. In 47:25, I believe it speaks to the idea that. But again, I want to emphasize the idea that only God could have caused Pharaoh to promote a man like Joseph, who had no political experience, okay? And he had a questionable background at best to the position that he appointed him to. A difficult position, a difficult position. Even without, that would be a hard position without a famine, okay? But with a famine, it's even worse. As I said, a foreigner, a former slave, an ex-convict, and the plan, and think of it, so there's this plan on how to cope with the famine. Where did the plan come from? Yeah, and then who interpreted Pharaoh's dreams? Joseph. So Joseph even had interpreted the dreams. So the entire plan is based upon this interpretation of the king's dreams. And he's really, what is happening here is that entire nation. Can you imagine what it's going to be like when America has to change its lifestyle? Oh, baby. When the spigot is turned off to the welfare system, can you imagine what that's going to be like? It's going to be tough times. So, but that's what's happening here. This whole entire nation is changing its lifestyle based upon a slave, ex-convict foreigner's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. And as part of his job, think about what Joseph had to do. He had to consider or calculate the amount of grain that was produced and consumed in Egypt on an annual basis. He had to estimate the present population and the future population over a 14-year time frame. He had to find places to store the grain. He had to appoint honest and wise men to facilitate the work that was needed, because they were going to have to build storehouses and other things. He had to train harvesters, overseers, accountants. There had to be guards hired. There had to be construction workers. And all of these things fell under his purvey. So he had to be an exceptional administrator. He had to be a good judge of character. He had to practice diplomacy. He had to be up to snuff on immigration issues. Why? He didn't build a wall, but he knew who was in Egypt. You know how? Because they're all coming to him to get food. So he had to be well versed in immigration issues. I imagine that there may have even been some kind of increase in crime, people trying to steal food from each other. So all of these things underneath the government that had been turned over to Joseph, and he had to execute this program and try to keep what became, in essence, a welfare system, okay? It was a welfare system. The state was providing everything for these people, and he had to create a welfare system that would eventually promote a non-welfare system, okay? Because a lot of these people who at one time may have been farmers, who at one time may have been merchants, really were nothing anymore during the famine. They didn't have anything. The main thing was the main thing that was functioning in the country at that time was the government itself. So it was a big, big, big job. And but Joseph had a plan, right? And whose plan was it? It was God's plan. So Joseph, since it was God's plan, he wasn't overwhelmed by the whole thing. He just kept relying on God. And as think about what we've talked about before. What does caravan mean? Caravan in its original meaning meant to be on God's path. Okay? Joseph stayed on God's caravan. Okay? Going over the next hurdle, the next trial, the next victory, whatever the next defeat might be, he kept on God's pathway for him. Okay? So, how do you think that how do you see Joseph's early years preparing him for the things he's gone through in Egypt? What's he gone through in Egypt? Slavery, prison, and now leadership. Think about his childhood, his adolescent years. How do you think he was prepared for those things? Huh? Huh? He had to defend himself against his brothers? Okay. He was what? He had a loving father, okay. He was being prepared for leadership. The father would have been, as the heir apparent, he would have been prepared for that. He came from what kind of family? Dysfunctional, but also blended, big blended family. So he was used to working with a lot of different personalities, a lot of different people, a lot of different high-stress situations, I would say. Okay? No, I don't know about that. How do you think that slavery in any way prepared him for prison? What would slavery teach you? Yeah, that's exactly right. And humility can be an asset, I think, in prison, because you don't want to draw too much attention to yourself. I think, and that humility, I think, led him to always think of the needs of others, because at one time he had almost everything as the member of a very fortunate family, and then he had everything taken away. How do you think prison might have prepared him for the position he ultimately fulfilled in the government of Pharaoh? Okay. It continued to prepare him administratively. Okay. And remember one thing, even though he was in such a precarious position, Joseph would be a good witness today, don't you think? Because he never had any trouble telling anybody about God. He went to Pharaoh when Pharaoh had the power over him to release him from prison or to put him back in prison, and the first thing he talked about was his God. Okay? First thing he talked about. You know, when you're confronted with a series of decisions and situations, it's good sometimes to look back on those things and get a perspective after you go through them of what has actually transpired in your life. Because God is working in your life to mold you into the believer that He wants you to be, okay? You know, I know people, I have known people that stress because they know people that are in too much stress. Yeah, I do. I know people that actually stress because they're worried about people that are under too much stress. Joseph is a good example of how to handle stress. But tonight I'd just like you to take a minute and think about yourself. How do you represent yourself on the worry scale, okay? And I've given you a worry scale in your outline, okay? Where do you fit yourself on that scale with, 1, you don't worry about anything? That'd be quite a deal, huh? I wonder how you do that. What would you call that? You're probably right. Dead, okay. And then with a 10 being always worried. The two opposing ends. The one never worried, and then 10 always worrying. And I'm not going to ask you to share those with me. You know, I have my moments of worrying. Here's a little thing I read. It says, "Don't tell me that worry doesn't do any good. I know better than that. The things I worry about don't happen." Get it? You get it? The things I worry about don't happen. Don't tell me that worry doesn't do any good. I know better than that. The things I worry about don't happen. I don't know, the source was unknown for that, so he's probably worried himself to death or something. But many people, listen, I don't think I've counseled with any warriors that wanted to be warriors, okay? And it's incredible. I was talking to this lady today, this Mormon lady, and you know what her biggest problem is? Stress and worry. So I had some pretty good ideas how to help her in that area. But worry is bad for you physically, okay? There's all these studies, you know. And they haven't said, it's not like coffee, you know. For one decade, coffee's good, and one decade, it's bad, and eggs are good, and then their eggs are bad. Worry has always been noted as being bad. It's bad for you physically, it's bad for you mentally, and it's really bad for you spiritually, okay? And oftentimes, especially with Christians want to be able to control their circumstances and their situation and their environment. But that's not the way it works. God tells us in His Word not to be anxious for anything, right? Not to be stressed. So whether you circled a 0 on that scale or a 1 on that scale, and if you did, you can come see me afterwards and share your secrets to a worry-free life. Or you circled a 10, or you're somewhere in between. I want you to look at some godly advice in regards to worry. And the first one is Psalm 18:6. And as somebody reads that for us, think how you might be able to apply that verse personally to your life. Psalm 18:6, somebody.
In my distress I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From His temple He heard my voice. My cry came before Him into His ears.
Yeah. So, when you're under stress, what do? You cry to the Lord. You call out to the Lord. You pray. Is there such a thing as good prayers and bad prayers? Is there? You pray. Pray with a pure heart. You know, ask the Lord to forgive you where you need forgiveness, and pray. And that says that He's going to hear you, correct? Okay. So if you have stressful or worrisome things in your life, pray. Psalm 37:25. Somebody read that for us, please.
I have been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread.
So he's saying He's not seen the righteous forsaken, and neither has He seen them begging for bread. That doesn't necessarily mean they haven't run out of bread, but He hasn't seen them begging for it. Why do you think they might not beg for it? Because maybe God's family is there to help them, okay? So that's just to reassure you of your condition. God, after all, does care about the birds, right? He provides for the animals. Yeah. Psalm 42:5. What's it say?
Why are you so downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed in me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise Him, my Savior and my God.
So that says if you put your hope in God, you get what? Strength? Is that what it said? Put your hope in God, and you get strength. So what does that mean if you don't put your hope in God? You're not going to get strength. So you need to put your hope in the Lord, okay? Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Matthew 11, 28 through 30.
Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will have rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my load is light.
Have you ever, I wasn't going to do this. Have you ever taken that apart and really looked at it and really looked at what it says? Matthew 11, 28 through 30.
I would love to hear a good explanation of that.
You would? Well, then I better not explain it because I probably don't have one. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. Look at Matthew 5:3, which should be the first of the Beatitudes. I call them the attitudes. Matthew 5:3. What does Matthew 5:3 say?
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Okay. Okay. So it's kind of an echo to that idea. And this, see what this is, what is this passage? It's an invitation. And what's the invitation? When he says, come to me, it's an invitation to come to Christ, okay? But the ones who, but who are the ones that respond to the invitation?
Those that are weary and have heavy burdens.
Yeah. And you know what that typifies? That typifies the lost before they're found. I had a heavy burden before I came to know the Lord. When you're spiritually bankrupt, and you attempt to live a moral life on your own, you become very burdened. There's going to be burdened people here Saturday, and we're going to preach the gospel. And we'll see if maybe we can help some of those people get rid of their burden. But, humanity is naturally stubborn in regards to hanging on to its sin. And the only thing that can save that is the acknowledgement of who you are and how spiritually bankrupt you are. Spiritually, I think MacArthur calls it dwelling in spiritual poverty. And that's why in verse 27, what does he say in 27? All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, okay? Our salvation is the sovereign work of God, but the proof of divine election is incompatible with the free offer to all. I'm going to talk Sunday night about, we're in that portion of Peter's sermon where he talks about foreknowledge. And I'm going to try to explain that word. And it's a very important word to understand because it's oftentimes mistaught and even more times misunderstood. So what we have here in Matthew is an invitation. So if you're worrying too much, if you have friends that worry too much, okay, you know who's beset by worry? people that are mentally infirm. Yeah. They're beleaguered by worry. They always are worrying. The answer to that worry is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the one that can answer that worry in their life. Look at Luke 12. That's not a very good explanation, but
Also, people that, I know someone that's quite mentally ill that's happy all the time.
yeah,
Believes in Jesus Christ,
yeah,
but it doesn't have worry.
okay. Yeah, there's those people too.
Yeah.
Look at Luke 12 for me. 22 through 29. Luke 12, 22 through 29. Then he said to his disciples, so think about your life application here. He says, therefore I say to you, what does he say? Don't worry about your life. Don't worry about what you eat, nor about your body, what you will put on in regards to what you'll wear. Life is more than food, and the body is more than what you put on it. Consider the ravens, okay, for they neither sow nor reap, which have neither storehouse nor barn, and God feeds them. How much more value are you than those birds, okay? And which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to your stature? Can you worry yourself to be taller? I wish. I'd like to be a little taller, you know. Straighten out my bow legs, maybe I'd be a little bit taller. But if you then are not able to do the least, why are you anxious for the rest? In other words, you can't do the very simplest of things. Why do you worry about doing more complicated things? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, and yet I say to you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. If then God so clothes the grass, which today is in the field and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you should eat or what you should drink, nor have an anxious hand. For all these things the nations of the world seek after, and your Father knows that you need these things. So in other words, don't worry about that stuff, because God knows what you need, not what you want. Well, he knows what you want too, but that's a different thing all entirely. But he knows what you need, and he will take care of what you need. Okay? And then the last one. And if you need to interrupt me, just go ahead and interrupt me. Philippians 4, 6 and 7, if you have any comment.
Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. Do I keep going?
6 and 7.
Oh, in the peace of God which surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ, for Christ Jesus.
So the innuendo there is that when you worry about stuff, at least if you're a Christian, when you worry about stuff, that is an indicator of what? Lack of faith. Amen. Because all the difficulties in your life, okay, are placed there, all of them, either directly or indirectly. I could teach. Somebody asked me about it was Arlene, about trials and tribulation. I'm not sure how we got there, because we had a long discussion after Mary's story the other night, on Sunday night, about that pastor that died. Arlene wanted to know, when are we dead? So I told her, when we're dead. And then somehow we went from when we're dead to some other areas, and one of the things that we ended up talking about is being anxious for nothing, because when you have great anxiety as a child of God, it shows that you're not trusting in God's wisdom. You got to let him work. And she asked me, the trials in our lives, it was because of some of Roger's teaching about trials. And she said, why are the trials in our life put into our life? Well, what's the purpose of man? To glorify God is the purpose of man, okay? And so no matter what the situation, even when somebody places you in a negative situation, okay? When they burdenize you, how you respond to that situation can still be used to glorify God, correct? And when we're faced with trials or tribulations, we, as God's people, have choices to make in that process that can bring God glory, or we might make decisions designed to bring us glory or to bring somebody else glory. But in every situation, even in the loss of an infant child, yeah, even in the loss of an infant child, See, the one thing we don't understand about losing people, we don't know their future. You don't know what might have happened later in life to that child. I remember telling a 6th grade girl about her father who had committed suicide in my office at the Christian school. And her father had a lot of issues in his life, and he was in a lot of turmoil. And I tried to explain to her, I tried to help her understand that you don't know where he was going. Maybe God actually made it easier for him by taking him now rather than taking him 10 years from now. So we just don't understand those things. We don't know those things. Those are God things. They're not people things, okay? Look at Hebrews 4:16. I'm gonna finish up here in a minute.
Let us therefore come boldly into the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need.
Yeah. In the ancient world, kings were almost unapproachable. Only their inner circle was able to get anywhere near them because they were worried about their security and stuff. But here we're told that our king, what we're talking about in this particular section, is our high priest. We can come before our king with boldness, and he is. What does it say? We can find grace to help in time of need. Wow, that's a pretty good statement, huh? We can find grace to help in time of need. Do you need grace? Judy's family needs grace. There's people in Judy's family that don't know the Lord. And so we need to be praying for those folks on Saturday morning and see maybe the occasion of her death will cause some of them to consider their position. And then 1 Peter 5. Yes.
Just want to ask, what time is that again?
10:30. 1 Peter 5, verses 6 and verse 7. Okay? And most of you know this rather well. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you. This is the one you want to read to Miles, Anita and Roger. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud. He gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. So that's the picture you need to have. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, okay? And then he will exalt you in due time. And that's almost a perfect description of the life of Joseph up to this point. He humbled himself before God. He had to accept what God was doing in his life. That's the only way I think he was able to survive. He humbled himself before God, and then God exalted him in God's time, not in Joseph's time. Because if Joseph had it his way, Joseph would have climbed out of the pit, would he not? And then what would have happened? If Joseph had climbed out of the pit, think of the ramifications of that action. If he had been able to get out of the pit, he never would have went to Europe, okay? He never would have been able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. He never would have been able to save his own country and the outlying countries from the famine, and his own family would have perished, most likely perished. So he may not have wanted to submit. God placed part of his things were beyond his control. But I think he had control in some things. I think he could have tried to run away. I think he could have tried to do some of those things. So, okay? Anybody? Anybody with any comments? Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for your attentiveness. Let's stand.